Before we start the story, write in the comments where you are watching from. Eve walked into the office building early that morning, clutching her coffee cup tightly as she made her way through the polished marble lobby. The early morning rush was in full swing, and she could feel the weight of the day already settling on her shoulders. As she approached the elevator, she bumped into another assistant, Sarah, who gave her a hurried nod before rushing off to attend to a last-minute task. Eve, always a bit of a perfectionist when it came to her work, made sure to check her watch and prepared herself for another chaotic day at Thorne Enterprises. The coffee in her hand was a small comfort. The warm liquid inside the paper cup seemed to promise at least a few minutes of peace before the storm of emails, calls, and meetings began. But as fate would have it, peace was not something Eve was destined to have. The elevator doors opened, and as she stepped inside, her hand brushed against the side of the sleek metal interior, causing a brief moment of imbalance. In an instant, her coffee cup tipped, and the dark liquid splashed, directly onto the suit of none other than Alexander Thorne, the CEO himself. Her heart stopped. Eve stood frozen, wide-eyed, as Alexander Thorne, the man who never seemed to crack under pressure, stood there in disbelief. The coffee stain spread across his crisp white shirt, and his eyes narrowed with the kind of intensity that made even the most seasoned professionals quake. Eve's throat went dry, and she could barely gather the courage to speak. I'm so sorry, she blurted out, her face turning a bright shade of red. I didn't mean to. Alexander's voice cut through the air, cold and controlled. This is your doing? She nodded helplessly, her hands trembling as she tried to offer him a napkin, but he waved it away. His gaze was sharp, the lines of his face tight with annoyance, but something flickered in his eyes, something Eve couldn't quite place. I'm truly sorry, Mr. Thorne. I'll get it cleaned, I promise. Please let me. He held up a hand, silencing her. Just get it fixed. Now. As the elevator doors closed, Eve couldn't help but feel a strange mix of mortification and frustration. Of all the ways to start a Monday, she had somehow managed to embarrass herself in front of the most intimidating man in the company. And as the elevator ascended to the higher floors, she couldn't help but wonder how this day would unfold, knowing that her blunder had just marked the beginning of something far more complicated than a simple coffee stain. The following days felt like a haze of tension and awkwardness for Eve. Every time she crossed paths with Alexander, whether in the elevator or the office lobby, there was an uncomfortable silence that hung between them. It was as if her accident had cast a permanent shadow over their interactions. Despite her repeated apologies, Alexander never once offered a genuine response, only a terse nod or a cold stare. Eve did her best to focus on her tasks, keeping her head down and trying not to think about the constant presence of the CEO's piercing eyes in the back of her mind. One evening, as she stayed late at the office to finish some work, she found herself in the elevator again. The last thing she expected was for the doors to open, revealing none other than Alexander Thorne himself. His eyes locked with hers for a moment, a flicker of something she couldn't place. Curiosity? Amusement? Then, without a word, he stepped inside, pressing the button for the top floor. The silence between them was deafening. So, Eve began, her voice awkward. How's your shirt? Alexander glanced at her with a slight tilt of his head, but his expression was unreadable. It's fine, he replied curtly. The tension lingered, and Eve could feel her palms beginning to sweat. She was acutely aware of the distance between them, the weight of the silence pressing down on her. I didn't mean to make you angry, she said quietly, unable to stop herself. It was a mistake, and I'm really sorry. Alexander didn't answer right away. The elevator hummed quietly as it moved upward, and Eve couldn't help but glance at him from the corner of her eye. She wondered if he ever thought about the accident, or if she was the only one who still replayed the embarrassing moment in her mind. After a long pause, Alexander spoke, his voice colder than before. You should be more careful. Eve nodded, her heart sinking. She wanted to say something else, anything to break the tension, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she stood there, hoping for the elevator ride to end as quickly as possible. The next few days passed in a similar fashion: strained interactions, tense silences, and a growing sense of dread whenever she was in his presence. Eve couldn't shake the feeling that her clumsy mistake had irreparably damaged any chance of a normal working relationship with the CEO. But as much as she tried to avoid him, there was a strange pull, a magnetic force that seemed to draw her back to him. She couldn't deny the attraction she felt, nor the growing sense that there was more to Alexander than met the eye. What was behind that cold, detached exterior? And would she ever be able to break through it? The story of their entangled lives was just beginning. It had been nearly a week since the coffee incident, and Eve was still trying to make herself scarce when Alexander was around. His cold demeanor hadn't softened one bit, and his stoic presence continued to cast a shadow over the office floor. Eve couldn't help but notice the way everyone around him seemed to walk on eggshells. It wasn't just her. Everyone avoided crossing him, and the staff seemed to be in constant motion, doing whatever they could to stay out of his way. Despite his chilling behavior, Eve couldn't completely shake the feeling that there was more to Alexander than his carefully crafted, unapproachable exterior. There were moments, tiny, almost imperceptible moments, when the mask would slip. It might be in the way he would run his fingers through his hair when he was lost in thought, or the slight crease between his brows when he was deep in contemplation. It was these little glimpses of vulnerability that left Eve wondering if maybe, just maybe, the man who ruled over Thorne Enterprises wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. One particular Friday afternoon, Eve found herself alone in the office, buried under an endless pile of paperwork. The office was eerily quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of printers and the occasional click of a keyboard. The clock ticked slowly toward the end of the day, and Eve couldn't shake the exhaustion weighing her down. She had stayed late again, trying to make up for the time she'd wasted on the previous mishap with Alexander. She was lost in her work when the door to her office opened with a soft click. Eve looked up, startled, expecting to see her boss's assistant, Claire, or one of the other staff members. Instead, she found herself staring at none other than Alexander Thorne himself, standing in the doorway, looking as cold and unreadable as ever. She froze. "Mr. Thorne?" she said, her voice almost too quiet. "Is everything okay?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped into the office, his gaze sweeping over the papers scattered across her desk. His usual crisp suit was now slightly loosened, as though he'd just come from a long day of meetings, but his sharp eyes still bore into her with the same icy intensity. "I need the financial reports for the third quarter," he said, his voice as authoritative as ever. "I'm meeting with the board at 8 a.m. tomorrow." Eve nodded, scrambling to locate the documents on her desk. She knew he could get anything he wanted without even having to ask. But there was something about his sudden appearance in her office that made her heart race. She handed him the folder, trying to maintain a professional demeanor, but her mind was racing. Was this an excuse to speak to her? Was he still angry over the coffee incident? Or was this just business as usual? He took the folder without a word, but instead of turning to leave, he lingered by the door, his gaze now fixed on her. Eve's pulse quickened, and she tried to appear unaffected by his proximity, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. "You've been staying late every day this week," he said, his voice low and slightly softer than usual. Eve looked up at him, caught off guard by the question. She hadn't expected him to notice, let alone comment on it. "It's nothing," she replied, offering a small smile. "Just trying to keep up with the workload." Alexander didn't respond right away, but his eyes softened ever so slightly, the coldness around him seeming to dissipate, if only for a moment. "You should take care of yourself," he said, his voice almost begrudging. "Burnout won't help anyone." Eve blinked, surprised by his words. For a moment, she wondered if she'd misheard him. Alexander Thorne, the untouchable CEO, telling her to take care of herself? It was a side of him she had never seen before. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice quieter now, a bit unsure. He nodded, his usual composure returning. He turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. Without looking back at her, he said, "And next time, don't spill coffee on me." The remark was said with just the faintest trace of amusement, a fleeting crack in his otherwise impassive demeanor. Eve felt a warmth spread through her chest at the unexpected lightness in his tone, even if it was brief. She hadn't realized how much she needed that reassurance, especially from someone who usually seemed so distant and unapproachable. As the door clicked shut behind him, Eve sat back in her chair, her heart still racing from the strange, unanticipated encounter. She tried to focus on the work in front of her, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Alexander's words. What was it about him that made her feel this way? Why did she care so much about what he thought of her? The question lingered in her mind, but there were no easy answers. It was a feeling she didn't understand, and perhaps didn't want to. After all, she was just his secretary, and he was the CEO. A coffee spill and a few casual words didn't change that. The following week, Eve's perception of Alexander began to shift. Despite his continued coldness, she found herself looking for those fleeting moments where the walls around him seemed to crack just a little. And surprisingly, they were becoming more frequent. One late afternoon, Eve was working late again, this time preparing a presentation for an upcoming board meeting. She was so focused on the screen that she didn't notice Alexander standing in the doorway of her office until he cleared his throat. Startled, Eve jumped, her hand slipping from the mouse and causing the screen to flicker. She quickly straightened in her chair, trying to compose herself. "Mr. Thorne, I didn't hear you come in." He was holding a cup of coffee in his hand, and his usual sharp suit looked more relaxed, the top button of his shirt undone. Eve couldn't help but notice how different he seemed when he wasn't in his usual corporate armor. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I just thought you could use a break." Eve blinked, not sure if she had heard him correctly. He had brought her coffee. She had expected him to come in with another request or task, but this was something else entirely. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't help but feel a strange flutter in her chest. Alexander Thorne, the man who never showed any emotion, was showing kindness. It was confusing, and somehow more intimate than she was ready to admit. "I'll leave you to it," he said, turning toward the door. But before he left, he hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. "You're doing well, Eve. Keep it up." She was left standing there, holding the cup in her hands, staring at the door as it clicked shut behind him. His words echoed in her mind, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than the icy exterior he worked so hard to maintain. But as she sipped the coffee, she couldn't shake the feeling that this strange, unexpected connection between them was only the beginning of something far more complicated. The days that followed were filled with the usual hustle and bustle of the corporate world, meetings, emails, deadlines. But there was an unspoken shift in the air. The tension between Eve and Alexander, while still palpable, had become less uncomfortable. It was as though the walls they had both built around themselves were slowly starting to erode, brick by brick, though neither of them would ever admit it out loud. It was another late evening when the unexpected happened. Eve had stayed at the office yet again, determined to get ahead of her work and make sure everything was perfect for the upcoming presentation. She glanced at the clock, nearly 8:30 p.m. The office had emptied out hours ago, and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound filling the space. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching until they were almost upon her. "Eve." She looked up, startled, to find Alexander standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable as usual, but there was something different about the way he looked at her. His sharp gaze was softer, almost uncertain. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he began, his voice lower than usual. "But I need your help with something." Eve blinked, unsure if she had heard him right. Alexander never asked for help. He delegated, he commanded, but he never asked. "What is it?" she said, setting her papers aside and standing up from her desk. Her heart began to race as she instinctively straightened her blouse, though she knew he wouldn't care about such things. He hesitated for a moment, a flicker of something passing through his eyes before he spoke again. "I need you to look over this proposal. I'm not sure it's ready for the board meeting tomorrow. I'd like your opinion." Eve was momentarily taken aback. Was the great Alexander Thorne, who always had everything under control, asking for her opinion? "Of course," she said quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll take a look." He handed her a thick folder, and she immediately began flipping through it. The proposal was complex, filled with financial data and strategic plans, but it wasn't the contents that made her pause. It was the fact that Alexander was standing just a few feet away, watching her. His usual aloofness seemed to melt away, and for a fleeting moment, he looked almost vulnerable. "Tell me what you think," he said quietly, leaning slightly against the doorframe. Eve studied the document, but her mind was partially occupied by the way Alexander was acting. This wasn't the same man who ruled Thorne Enterprises with an iron fist. The person before her seemed almost human. Her thoughts began to swirl as she scanned the numbers and charts. As much as she admired his intellect, Eve had never seen Alexander as anything more than a cold, distant CEO. Yet here he was, seeking her help, something she never would have expected. "Well," she began cautiously, "I think the projections look solid, but the strategy in the second section could use some adjustments. The risk factors aren't fully addressed here, and the way the market trends are presented feels a bit too optimistic." She glanced up from the proposal, meeting his gaze for a split second before looking back down at the paper. "But I think it's a solid start." He nodded, listening intently, his gaze never leaving her as she spoke. "You're right," he said finally, a small appreciative smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I had my doubts about that section too. I'll revise it before the meeting." The fact that Alexander Thorne was actually listening to her was surreal, and for a moment, Eve couldn't quite believe what was happening. This was the man who was rumored to never take advice from anyone, let alone a lowly secretary. She had always kept her distance, professionally, of course, but now, in this quiet moment, there was something undeniably personal about their interaction. "Thank you," Alexander said, his voice quiet but genuine. "You've helped more than you know." Eve nodded, a small smile spreading across her face. She wasn't sure what it was about this moment, whether it was the late hour, the unusual vulnerability he had shown, or simply the way he seemed to trust her. But something inside her shifted. She had always seen Alexander as an untouchable figure. But this felt different. "Any time, Mr. Thorne," she replied softly. She couldn't help but feel a sense of warmth spread through her chest. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he lingered in the doorway for a moment, his fingers brushing against the edge of the doorframe. His eyes softened, just the slightest hint of emotion breaking through his stoic exterior. "You should get some rest, Eve," he said after a pause, his voice oddly gentle. "It's late." "I will," she said with a smile, grateful for his concern. It wasn't something she expected from him. "Good night, Mr. Thorne." He nodded, his usual detached expression returning as he turned to leave. But just before he disappeared down the hallway, he paused and glanced back at her, a fleeting look of uncertainty crossing his face. "Good night, Eve." The words hung in the air as the door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time since their awkward coffee spill, Eve felt something she hadn't expected to feel. a connection. It was fragile, uncertain, and yet it was there, a thread that seemed to pull them together in ways neither of them could fully understand. As she sat back down at her desk, Eve couldn't help but wonder where this would lead. She had no illusions about Alexander. He was still the same intimidating, emotionally distant CEO, and she was still just his secretary. But the subtle moments they shared, whether it was a quiet word of advice, a fleeting moment of warmth, were beginning to stir something inside her, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Days passed, and the brief encounter in her office seemed to hang in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. Eve couldn't help but replay it in her mind. Alexander's words, the way his gaze lingered on her. It was as though something had shifted between them, but neither of them had acknowledged it outright. In the days that followed, Eve continued to throw herself into her work, trying to keep her mind occupied, but her thoughts kept returning to Alexander, to the way he had been that night. It was a side of him she had never seen before, and as much as she tried to ignore it, the pull between them seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. One morning, after a particularly hectic meeting with clients, Eve found herself unexpectedly alone in the elevator with Alexander. The sudden proximity left her heart racing, and she instinctively pressed her back against the wall, trying to keep some distance between them. Neither of them spoke for the first few moments, the silence stretching between them like an invisible thread. Then, just as the elevator reached their floor, Alexander glanced at her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Eve was taken aback by the question. "I'm fine, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice quiet, though she couldn't suppress the warmth that spread through her at his concern. The elevator doors opened, and as she stepped out, Alexander followed her, his presence still a looming force behind her. She couldn't help but wonder what had brought on his sudden attentiveness. Was it the work? Or something else? The unspoken tension between them continued to build, and Eve wasn't sure how much longer she could keep ignoring it. The days following their brief elevator exchange felt like walking a tightrope. Eve noticed that Alexander was more present, even if only in subtle ways. He was no longer the distant CEO who passed her by without a glance. Now, there were moments where their eyes would meet across the office, a brief, unspoken understanding passing between them. It was as if the coffee incident, once so awkward and cringeworthy, had unlocked something that neither of them had expected. Eve did her best to maintain professionalism, but it was difficult. The glances he would throw her way, just enough to make her heart skip a beat, were starting to unravel her carefully constructed armor. She had always been the reliable, no-nonsense secretary, but now, it seemed as if every interaction with Alexander was slowly chipping away at the walls she had built around herself. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Eve found herself sitting at her desk, glancing over a pile of reports. The office had quieted down, and she welcomed the solitude. It had been a long day, and she could feel the weight of exhaustion creeping up on her. Just as she was about to stretch, the door to her office opened, and in walked Alexander. "Eve," he said, his voice low and smooth, as always. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course, Mr. Thorne," she replied, sitting up straighter in her chair. There was something different in his tone today, something that felt more personal, more intimate than the usual business-like requests. Alexander closed the door behind him and stepped further into her office. He seemed uncertain. Gone was the confident, commanding CEO, replaced by a man who looked almost hesitant. Eve raised an eyebrow, confused by his change in demeanor. "What's going on? Is everything okay?" Alexander took a deep breath, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair as if trying to gather his thoughts. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before returning to meet hers. "Apologize? For what?" Well, for the way I've been acting. I haven't been fair to you, and I wanted to acknowledge that." He paused, clearly trying to choose his words carefully. "You've been nothing but professional, and I haven't made it easy for you." Eve blinked, stunned. She had always seen him as untouchable, unwavering, cold, and completely in control. But now he was standing before her, vulnerable in a way that made her heart ache. She wasn't sure what to say. "Mr. Thorne, Alexander," he corrected gently, his eyes softer than usual. "You've earned the right to call me that." Her breath caught in her throat. Alexander Thorne was asking her to call him by his first name. She had never imagined such a moment. There was something about the simplicity of it that felt profound, as though a barrier between them had been breached. "Alexander," she whispered, tasting his name on her tongue. It felt strange, yet oddly fitting. He looked relieved by her response, though his expression remained pensive. "I don't know what happened with us, but I want you to know that I respect you, Eve, more than you probably realize." Eve swallowed hard, her heart racing. She hadn't expected to hear those words from him, not in a million years. Alexander had never been one to express appreciation, let alone admit vulnerability. And yet, here he was, standing in front of her, his usual impenetrable facade cracked open just enough for her to see a side of him that few people ever did. "I appreciate that," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood there for a moment in silence, neither of them knowing exactly what to do next. It was an unusual moment for both of them, too intimate for their usual dynamic, too heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "You've been working late a lot," he said, his voice low but filled with concern. "You should take a break. Go home. Get some rest." Eve was taken aback by the sudden tenderness in his voice. It wasn't like him to show such concern, let alone suggest that she take a break. But there was something in his eyes, something that made her want to believe he truly cared about her well-being. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. The long hours were starting to take their toll, and she felt her energy draining with each passing day. But she couldn't bring herself to admit it. "Really, it's just the usual workload." Alexander didn't look convinced. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her. "You don't have to pretend with me, Eve. You're not just my secretary. You're someone I care about. And I don't want to see you burn out." Eve's heart skipped a beat at his words. Someone I care about. She had never imagined hearing him say something like that. Her mind raced as she tried to process what he meant by that statement. Was it simply the professional concern of a boss for his employee? Or was there something more? Before she could respond, Alexander turned toward the door, his shoulders slightly hunched, as though the weight of his own emotions was becoming too much to bear. "Please, just take care of yourself, Eve," he said, his voice barely audible. She nodded, though she didn't trust herself to speak. The air between them was charged with so many emotions, too many to unpack in a single moment. As he left her office, Eve felt a strange sense of longing in her chest. She wasn't sure what was happening between them, but it was clear that things were changing. Slowly, imperceptibly, the connection between them was deepening. She sat back in her chair, trying to steady her racing thoughts. What does this all mean? She wondered. She had never imagined that her clumsy coffee-spilling accident would lead to this. This tangled web of emotions, vulnerability, and unspoken desires. But now that it had begun, there was no going back. It was a few days later when Eve found herself facing the consequences of their growing connection. It all started with another late-night meeting. This time, Alexander was more insistent. He had insisted that they work together on a proposal that was due at the end of the week. She could tell by the intensity in his eyes that it wasn't just about the work anymore. There was something deeper, something he was struggling to keep hidden. As they sat together in the conference room, the quiet hum of the office around them, Eve couldn't ignore the tension that seemed to hang in the air. It was as if the space between them had shrunk, drawing them closer and closer with each passing second. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of unspoken words, Alexander broke the silence. "Eve," he said, his voice low and intense. "There's something I need to tell you." Her heart skipped a beat as she looked at him, sensing the gravity in his tone. This wasn't just about the proposal. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what's happening between us," he confessed, his eyes meeting hers with a rawness that took her breath away. "But I can't ignore it anymore. I feel something for you, Eve. Something I shouldn't feel. But it's there. And it's real." Eve's world seemed to stop. The words he had spoken echoed in her mind. And for a moment, she couldn't find her voice. She had always tried to keep her distance, always maintained a professional barrier between them. But now, that barrier had crumbled, and there was no going back. "I feel it too," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Alexander's gaze softened, his expression filled with a mixture of relief and something deeper, something raw and vulnerable. "I don't know what this means," he said quietly, "but I don't want to lose what we have. Even if it's complicated, even if it's messy, I want to figure it out with you." Eve's heart fluttered in her chest, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something more to their connection than just business, something worth fighting for. The days following Alexander's confession were a blur for Eve. She tried to return to her usual routine, handling calls, managing meetings, organizing his calendar, but everything felt different. It was as if a new layer had been added to their relationship, something deeper and more complicated. Every glance, every word exchanged, carried a weight she hadn't noticed before. She wasn't sure what to do with it, or with herself. As much as she tried to maintain her professional composure, there was a part of her that was acutely aware of Alexander in ways she hadn't been before. The simple act of him entering a room made her pulse quicken. The brush of his hand against hers as they exchanged papers was enough to send electricity through her veins. Every time he looked at her, there was a depth in his gaze that she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the attraction. It was the vulnerability they'd both begun to share. There was something in the way Alexander had opened up to her, something raw and unfiltered, that made Eve feel as though they had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. It was late one evening when everything came to a head. The office was practically empty, save for the two of them. The hum of the overhead lights seemed to fill the silence as Eve sat at her desk, working on a presentation for an upcoming client meeting. She felt a familiar presence at her side before she even heard him approach. "Eve." Alexander's voice was soft but insistent. "Can we talk?" Eve looked up, meeting his gaze. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held an intensity that she couldn't ignore. She swallowed hard, feeling the tension rise between them. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. Alexander sat down in the chair opposite her, folding his hands in front of him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their emotions hung in the air like a heavy fog, neither of them daring to break the silence first. "I've been thinking a lot about what I said the other day," Alexander began, his voice low, almost vulnerable. "And I realized something. What I feel for you. It's not just about attraction. It's deeper than that. It's more than just the physical or the emotional." Eve's breath hitched. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear this, but she couldn't pull herself away. Every word he spoke seemed to peel back another layer of the complicated feelings she had tried so hard to ignore. "I'm scared," Alexander admitted, his voice rough. "I'm scared of what this could mean, what it could do to us, to everything. I've spent so many years keeping people at a distance, building walls around myself to protect me from feeling vulnerable. But with you, it's different." Eve's heart ached at the rawness in his voice. She'd always known that there was more to him than the cold, unapproachable CEO persona he projected. But hearing him admit his fears, his insecurities, made him seem more human, more real, than she had ever seen him before. "I'm scared too," Eve said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of what's happening between us. It's so unexpected. I've always kept a wall up too, because I've learned the hard way that people disappoint you. But with you," she trailed off, unsure of how to put her feelings into words. Alexander's gaze softened, and for the first time, he reached out, placing his hand on hers. The simple touch sent a shockwave through her, and she had to fight the urge to pull away. "Eve, I'm not asking you to make a decision right now," he said gently. "But I want you to know that I'm willing to take the risk. I want to figure this out, even if it's complicated. Even if it means exposing parts of myself that I've kept hidden for years." Eve felt a lump form in her throat. She had always admired his strength, his ability to control everything around him. But now, as he sat there in front of her, exposing his vulnerabilities, she saw him in a different light. He was no longer the untouchable millionaire CEO. He was just a man, trying to navigate the messiness of life and love. "I don't know what the future holds," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "But I'm willing to try, Alexander. I'm willing to see where this goes." He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his face. It was the first time she had seen him smile like that, without the mask of the CEO. And in that moment, Eve knew that they had crossed a line, one that would forever change the course of their relationship. But there was no turning back. The days that followed were filled with both exhilarating highs and challenging lows. Eve found herself constantly thinking about Alexander, about their moments together. They were still navigating the complexities of their relationship, balancing the professional with the personal, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to keep them separate. Work had become a battleground of emotions. There were moments of undeniable chemistry between them, moments where they seemed to forget the world around them. And yet, there were times when the pressure of their positions and the complications of their connection seemed to threaten everything they had built. Eve would catch Alexander's gaze from across the office, and her heart would race. She knew he felt the same pull, the same magnetic force drawing them together. But they both understood that they couldn't let their personal feelings interfere with the business they had to accomplish. The stakes were too high. Late one evening, when the office was almost empty, Eve stayed behind to finish some work. She was trying to keep herself focused, but her mind kept drifting to Alexander, his smile, his touch, the way he made her feel more alive than she ever had before. It was both thrilling and terrifying. The door to her office opened quietly, and she looked up to find Alexander standing there, his expression unreadable. He seemed distant, as though something was weighing heavily on his mind. "Eve," he said softly, his voice carrying a hint of unease. "We need to talk." Her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't help but wonder what had changed. Were they about to hit a breaking point? Had the tension finally become too much? "Of course," she replied, setting aside her work and standing up. "What's going on?" Alexander hesitated before stepping into the room, closing the door behind him. He ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowed in frustration. "I've been thinking about us," he began, his voice tight. "And I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. I've always been in control of my life, of everything. But now, I don't know how to handle what's happening between us." Eve's stomach churned with anxiety. She could feel the weight of his words settling over her like a storm cloud. Was he pulling away? Was he regretting his confession? "I don't want to make things harder for you," he continued, his voice softening. "But I can't ignore this anymore. I don't want to lose you, Eve. But I also don't want to ruin everything we've worked for." Eve took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't just about work anymore. It was about them, about their feelings, and about the choices they had to make. "I don't want to lose you either, Alexander," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But we can't keep pretending like we're not feeling this. We can't keep ignoring it." Alexander met her gaze, his eyes filled with both fear and determination. And in that moment, they both realized that the choice they faced wasn't about whether or not to pursue this connection. It was about how far they were willing to go, how much they were willing to risk. Together, they would have to navigate the storm. Together, they would have to decide whether to let their emotions define their future or whether to walk away, knowing that the path they had started to walk would never be the same again. The question was no longer about what they wanted. It was about what they were willing to give up. And Eve knew, deep down, that the answer was not as simple as she had once believed. As the days turned into weeks, the emotional intensity between Alexander and Eve continued to build. They both felt the pressure mounting in the office, as their relationship, though still discreet, became more undeniable. Every stolen glance, every private conversation in quiet corners of the office was a reminder that something had shifted irrevocably between them. Despite their efforts to maintain professionalism, it was becoming impossible to ignore the growing tension that hung in the air whenever they were together. Alexander's once steely demeanor had softened around her, revealing a side of him that Eve had only glimpsed in moments of vulnerability. She too found herself exposed in ways she hadn't expected. Her walls, once impenetrable, were beginning to crumble, bit by bit. That evening, Alexander invited her to a dinner meeting with a potential client, a high-stakes opportunity for the company. The dinner was set at one of the city's most prestigious restaurants, and the entire affair had been planned meticulously. As always, Alexander was the picture of control, his sharp suit and polished demeanor exuding the image of the successful CEO he had worked so hard to become. Eve, on the other hand, felt slightly out of place. She had always been comfortable in her role as Alexander's secretary, but tonight she was more than that. She was his companion, his confidant, and, whether either of them admitted it or not, someone with whom he shared more than just professional concerns. The reality of it all felt heavy on her shoulders, but she refused to let it show. Tonight was about the company. She could deal with their personal issues later, but as soon as she walked into the restaurant, the weight of the situation became all too real. The elegant setting, the low hum of conversation, and the polished clientele reminded her just how different their worlds were. And yet, as she looked at Alexander across the table, there was no denying that they were both part of the same world now, whether they wanted to be or not. The evening began like any other business dinner, with polite pleasantries and the formal exchange of information. Alexander was in his element, charming the client with his quick wit and sharp intellect. But Eve couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in his behavior when their eyes met. How his smile seemed a little warmer when directed at her. How his tone softened when he addressed her directly. As the dinner progressed, the conversation took a turn toward more personal matters. The client, sensing an opportunity to lighten the mood, asked Alexander about his life outside of work. "Well, I guess I don't have much of a personal life," Alexander replied with a dry chuckle. "It's hard to have one when you're constantly trying to keep a company running." Eve felt a pang of guilt at his words. She knew that, in some ways, that was true. Alexander had sacrificed much of his personal life for his career, but she also knew that he wasn't entirely telling the truth. He had started to open up to her in ways he hadn't done with anyone else, and she knew that it wasn't just about work anymore. "And what about you, Eve?" the client asked, turning the conversation in her direction. "I'm sure a beautiful woman like you must have quite the social life." Eve froze, caught off guard by the question. She hadn't expected to be the center of attention. Her gaze flickered to Alexander, but he was watching the client, his expression unreadable. She knew he was trying to maintain the facade of the professional, distant CEO, but there was something in his eyes that made her heart race. I'm just focused on work mostly," Eve said, offering a nervous smile. "There's not much time for anything else." Her words, though true, didn't entirely capture the complexity of her situation. She wasn't just focused on work. She was focused on Alexander. Her life had become intertwined with his in ways she hadn't anticipated, and now she had to confront the reality of it. As the evening wore on, the tension between them became more palpable. Their glances were longer, their words more careful. The professional distance they had once maintained was now a thin veil, barely holding up under the weight of everything unsaid. Eve wasn't sure how much longer they could keep pretending that nothing had changed. When the dinner finally came to an end, Alexander walked her to the car, his hand resting on the small of her back, in a gesture that felt both intimate and protective. The cold night air seemed to heighten the unspoken connection between them, and Eve couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. As they reached the car, Alexander paused, turning to face her. There was a moment of silence as they looked at each other, the weight of their shared emotions hanging in the air. "I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending that this is just business, Eve," he said softly. "Every time I see you, I feel something I can't ignore." Eve's heart skipped a beat. She had known that this day would come, that they would have to confront the reality of their feelings for each other. But hearing him say it out loud made everything feel so much more real. "I don't want to ignore it either," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. There was a vulnerability in his gaze that took her breath away. "Then what do we do now?" he asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. Eve took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She knew that whatever they chose to do, it would change everything. But for the first time, she realized that she wasn't afraid. She was ready to face whatever came next, because despite the risks, she knew that her feelings for him were undeniable. "I don't know," she said softly, her voice trembling. "But I think we have to take the next step." The following days were filled with questions and uncertainty. Alexander and Eve both knew that they couldn't keep living in this state of limbo, caught between their personal and professional lives. Something had to give, but neither of them was sure what that something should be. The decision they had to make was more than just about their relationship. It was about their futures, their careers, and how they saw themselves in the world. Alexander had spent years building his empire, and Eve had worked tirelessly to support him. But now, as their feelings for each other deepened, it was clear that they would have to choose between their personal desires and the realities of their high-stakes world. Would they risk everything for the chance at a relationship? Or would they walk away, knowing that the consequences could be just as devastating as the potential rewards? The days after their dinner were a blur. Eve couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted permanently between her and Alexander, and though she tried to maintain her usual composure at work, the tension was palpable. Every glance he shot her way, every moment their eyes met across the room, carried with it an unspoken promise, a temptation she found impossible to ignore. But she also knew that they couldn't simply continue as they had. They were walking a fine line, and the consequences of crossing it could be disastrous for both of them. Alexander, too, was struggling with the weight of what had happened. He had always prided himself on his control, over his company, over his life. But with Eve, he found himself letting go in ways he never expected. He had always been the one to call the shots, to make the decisions that guided the course of his future. But with her, things felt different. It was as if he was facing the uncertainty of a life he had never considered, a life outside of his business empire. One evening, as they worked late in the office, the familiar silence between them was broken by the sound of Alexander's voice. "Eve, we need to talk," he said, his tone grave. He had been waiting for the right moment, but now, in the quiet of the late hour, it felt as though there was no more time to waste. Eve looked up from the stack of papers in front of her, her heart racing. She had been anticipating this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure if she was ready for the conversation. "About what?" she asked, her voice betraying the uncertainty she felt inside. "About us," Alexander said simply. His expression was unreadable, his eyes locking onto hers with a mixture of resolve and hesitation. "I've been thinking about it, and I don't want to keep pretending that we can just ignore what's happening between us." Eve's breath caught in her throat. She had known this conversation was inevitable, but hearing him finally say it out loud made everything so much more real. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, gathering her thoughts. "I don't want to ignore it either," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we both know how complicated this is." "I know," Alexander said, his voice softening. He walked around the desk and stood in front of her, his presence commanding yet gentle. "I've built my life around this company. I've sacrificed so much for it. And now, with you, with us, I don't know what it means for everything else." Eve felt a lump form in her throat. She understood what he was saying all too well. She had seen the sacrifices he had made, the late nights and the pressure of running such a massive empire, and she knew that stepping into his world, really stepping into his life, would mean becoming part of that pressure, that relentless ambition. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that. "I've worked hard to get to where I am," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And I've always kept my distance, kept my personal life separate from work. I don't know if I can do that anymore, Alexander. I don't know if I can just be a part of your world without losing myself in the process." Alexander's face softened, and he took a step closer, his hand gently touching hers on the desk. "You won't lose yourself, Eve. I promise you. I don't want to take away what makes you, you. But I also don't want to keep pretending that what we have is just a passing thing. I'm not pretending anymore. And I don't want you to." Eve's heart raced in her chest as she absorbed his words. The vulnerability in his voice was something she hadn't expected, and it shook her in a way she wasn't prepared for. For all his strength, his success, Alexander was asking for something she couldn't easily give. Trust. Trust in him, in their relationship, and in the future they could build together. "I don't know what this means for us," she said, finally looking him in the eye. "But I know I can't keep living in limbo. We either take this seriously, or we walk away. No more half measures." Alexander nodded slowly, as though weighing her words. For a moment the office was silent, the weight of the decision hanging between them. Then, with a deep breath, he made his choice. "We take it seriously," he said with quiet conviction. "No more pretending. I don't want to lose you, Eve, and I'm willing to face whatever comes next, even if it means everything changes." Her heart fluttered at his words, but the reality of what this meant for both of them settled in. There was no going back now. They were crossing a line they could never uncross, and whatever came next, they would have to face it together. Eve nodded, her throat tight. "Then let's do it. Let's take the next step." The days after their conversation were both thrilling and terrifying. The air between them had shifted, no longer filled with the weight of unsaid words, but with the anticipation of something new and uncertain. They both knew that this was uncharted territory, a place where personal and professional lines would blur in ways they hadn't yet imagined. As they navigated their new dynamic, they began to realize the challenges they would face. Alexander's company wasn't just a business, it was his life. Every decision he made affected not just him, but the entire team that relied on him. And now, Eve was becoming an integral part of that life. There were days when the pressure seemed unbearable, when the weight of their secret threatened to crush them both. But through it all, there was an undeniable connection between them, one that refused to be ignored. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments of doubt and fear, but it was real. And in that reality, they found something they hadn't expected, a love that was worth fighting for. As Alexander and Eve's relationship began to evolve, so did the challenges they faced. It was one thing to admit their feelings for each other and take the first step toward something real, but it was another entirely to make it work in the world they inhabited. One of high-stakes decisions, unrelenting expectations, and constant pressure. Eve's role as Alexander's assistant had always kept her at the periphery of the corporate world he dominated, but now she was thrust into the spotlight, not just as an employee, but as a significant part of his life. They tried to keep things under wraps at work, their relationship a silent understanding that they guarded fiercely. But it wasn't easy. The walls between their professional and personal lives were thinning, and soon it became harder to separate the two. There were moments of awkwardness when their private connection made the professional one seem distant or strained. Late-night meetings meant long drives home together, filled with unspoken glances and moments of silence that both warmed and unsettled Eve. The weight of their secret felt heavier with each passing day, especially when it seemed like everyone at the office was beginning to sense that something was different between them. One afternoon, in the midst of preparing for an important client pitch, Eve found herself in the conference room with Alexander, reviewing the presentation slides. She noticed him fidgeting, his usual sharp focus slipping away. It had been a stressful few days, and the client meeting the next morning was critical to the company's future. Yet, as Eve looked at him, she could tell that his mind was elsewhere. "Alexander," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of concern. "You don't seem like yourself today. Is something wrong?" He didn't immediately answer. Instead, he stared at the slides before him, his jaw tight. "It's just a lot of pressure, Eve. I've been at this for so long, and I can't afford to fail now." Eve could sense the tension in his voice, the same tension that had taken hold of him ever since their conversation about their relationship. It wasn't just the work anymore, it was everything else. The possibility that they might not make it through the challenges ahead. She couldn't ignore that fear, nor could she ignore the growing doubts in her own mind. "I know how important this meeting is," she said, moving closer to him, her hand gently resting on his. "But you don't have to carry it all alone, Alexander. You have me. You've always had me, even when you didn't realize it." He turned to face her, and in that moment, the vulnerability he had shown her in private surfaced again. His eyes softened, and the intensity of his gaze was enough to make her breath catch in her throat. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to balance all of this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The company, the responsibilities, and you. I don't want to lose you, Eve. But I'm afraid that I'll lose myself in the process." Eve's heart clenched at his words. She had always seen Alexander as a man of immense strength, someone who had control over everything around him. But now, she was seeing a different side of him, one that was uncertain, one that was questioning his own ability to navigate the world he had so carefully constructed. "You won't lose yourself," she said, her voice steady. "You're not alone in this. We're in this together, Alexander. Whatever happens, I'm here." It wasn't the grand gesture he might have been expecting, nor the definitive answer to all of his worries, but it was enough. For the first time in a long while, Alexander felt the weight on his shoulders lift, if only slightly. He didn't have to carry it all, not anymore. The next morning, as they stood before the client, the energy in the room felt different. It wasn't just the typical professional tension. It was something more personal, more intimate. Alexander's confidence was back, bolstered by the quiet assurance of Eve's presence beside him. And Eve, though nervous, was ready. She had always been there for him, and now she was ready to stand beside him in the face of everything that awaited them. The client pitch was a success, and with it came a sense of relief for both Alexander and Eve. They had navigated the stormy waters of their personal and professional lives for the moment, but the road ahead was still uncertain. Their relationship, though now out in the open between the two of them, was still something they needed to figure out. There were obstacles to overcome, expectations to manage, and above all, the question of how they would continue to operate within the high-stakes corporate world that had shaped so much of who they were. In the weeks that followed, they made efforts to redefine their roles, both in the office and with each other. They spent late nights strategizing not just for the company, but for their future as a couple, how they could balance their professional lives with the budding, complex relationship they were now navigating. Eve had always been able to keep a level head, but she now found herself testing her own limits, trying to balance the growing demands of her personal life with the unrelenting pressures of the job. The quiet moments they shared were precious. There were times when Alexander would catch her gaze across the room, and they would share a look, one that conveyed everything they didn't need to say aloud. There were moments when she would reach out to him for support, and he would offer it without hesitation. Despite the weight of their circumstances, they had found something they hadn't expected: peace in each other's presence. But even as they grew closer, the outside world seemed determined to test them. The challenges of their relationship were far from over. Their love was something neither had planned for, but now it was undeniable. And no matter what happened, they knew that the future would require them both to be stronger than they had ever been before. For now, they had each other, and together, they would face whatever challenges awaited them, both in the corporate world and in their personal lives. As the final chapter in their journey approached, Alexander and Eve found themselves standing at a crossroads. The decisions they made now would shape the course of their lives, both professionally and personally. And although they couldn't predict what the future held, they had come to realize that the most important thing was not whether they could survive the obstacles in their path, but whether they could face them together. In the end, it wasn't the grand achievements or the corporate successes that defined their relationship. It was the quiet moments of understanding, the support they gave each other when it was needed most, and the unwavering belief that, no matter what, they could find a way to navigate the future hand in hand. Together, they chose to face whatever came next, knowing that love, in its truest form, was worth every challenge, every sacrifice. And in that, they found their happily ever after,